What's up, guys, and welcome back to our fourth and our final week, actually, in our Numbers series. You know, it has been a wild ride through some really weird stories that we find in the book of Numbers. Now, before we get to tonight's weird story, let's just kind of recap what we've learned so far. We don't want to miss out on anything. So the first week, we looked at the time that Miriam complained about Moses' wife, right? And there was a prejudice piece to her issue, and then there was also just about jealousy, right? Miriam wanted to be important like Moses, and because of her sin, that she was struck with leprosy. The lesson we learned from that story was that slander has no place in the life of a believer and that God doesn't tolerate racism. The second week, we looked at the story of Korah and his rebellion. Korah was also jealous of Moses, and he started stirring up division among the people. And God literally opened up the earth and swallowed up Korah and all of his supporters in one huge gulp. We learned the importance of unity through this story, and that we can live in unity with other believers without really having to agree on every single thing. Last week, we looked at the story of Balaam, a pagan spiritualist that God spoke to directly. And Balaam, he started a journey on his donkey and the donkey was able to see the angel of the Lord that was coming to end Balaam, and she tried to protect him, right? He ended up beating this donkey 3 times, at which point God said, you know what, donkey, go ahead and tell him what was up. So the donkey spoke to Balaam directly, and Balaam went on to teach the enemy king how to put stumbling blocks in front of the people of Israel, causing them to trip up on their own sin. And we learned through the story that our enemy is still doing the exact same thing today, and that we have to push sin away to keep from tripping over it in our lives. Now, this week's lesson is a little bit different, and we don't have some supernatural occurrence that punctuates our story. Instead, we see God deal with a legal issue. But what we see in God's answer is still ringing so true today, and we'll get to that. So let's go ahead and jump into the passage this week. We're going to actually look at 2 chunks this week, and we're going to start with Numbers 27. In this section, we meet a group of ladies known as the daughters of Zelophehad. It's a fun name, right? We don't really hear much about Zelophehad in Scripture, except that he had no son, only daughters. He was part of the older generation of Israelites that had to perish in the wilderness because of their sin, and that he wasn't part of the group that fell away with Korah. Now, as the passage picks up, a census had just been done of the people, and this was a way of counting the different tribes and families. And after the census was taken, they began splitting up the land. Each family would get pieces of the land that God had promised to them. But the problem comes up in Numbers 27:2, and here's what it says. They stood before Moses and before Eleazar the priest and before the chiefs and all the congregation at the entrance of the tent of meeting, saying, Our father died in the wilderness. He was not among the company of those who gathered themselves together against the Lord in the company of Korah, but died for his own sin. And he had no sons. Why should the name of our father be taken away from his clan because he had no son? Give to us a possession among our father's brothers. So as the people were dividing up the land, these sisters realized that since their father had passed away and there was no son in the family, due to the property laws in their culture, their father's name would just be lost, and they would have no land in their family name. You know, they were rightfully upset about this, and they took it to Moses. So Moses, he takes their request to God, and here's God's response a little bit later. The Lord said to Moses, The daughters of Zelophehad are right. You shall give them a possession of an inheritance among their father's brothers, and transfer the inheritance of their father to them. And you shall speak to the people of Israel, saying, If a man dies and has no son, then you shall transfer his inheritance to his daughter. God was quick to answer the request, and he was fair, as he always is, in the treatment of these sisters. Prior to this point, women couldn't have property of their own, right? Their possessions were their fathers and then their husbands. With no son in the picture, the name of Zelophehad would be forgotten, and these ladies would be left with nothing until they were able to marry into another family. So God instructed Moses to make a change in the way that people handled inheritances, right? If there wasn't a son, then the daughter would receive the inheritance. And the law was given for all the people, not just for the ladies in our story today. Like I said earlier, this wasn't some supernatural miracle here, right? God was just dealing with an injustice among the people. Now, if we jump forward a little bit further, we're going to see the daughters of Zelophehad come up again in chapter 36. The other people in the daughter's family, they were concerned about how the inheritance would impact the family when those ladies married. If they married someone from another tribe within Israel, then they would take their land with them, and the family of Manasseh, which is the bigger family that they were all part of, would have less land than they were supposed to, and whatever family the daughters married into would have more land thanks to the daughter's inheritance. I know it's kind of complicated and kind of weird to us today, but trying to keep the land split up fairly was a big deal in the unity of the people that we've talked about before. If one group seemingly had more than the others, it caused rumors and backstabbing and all kind of disunity. And God recognized the danger in this property ownership issue, and the solution was that the land wouldn't transfer between tribes due to marriage. In regard to the daughters of Zelophehad, specifically, they were to marry within their own tribe. The tribes were big enough that it wouldn't be as weird as it sounds to us today to marry someone that's in your extended family. It was actually a pretty common occurrence, as God had commanded the people to only intermarry with other Israelites and to ignore the pagans that were around them. So no leprosy, no earth-splitting hole, no talking donkey. What's so weird about today's story? The part I think we need to pay attention to is that God sees the value in the individual, and that is the most important thing to him, even over societal norms. In this time period, and for many centuries after that, women really had no rights. They couldn't own property. They were not much more than property themselves, honestly. This was man's law. God never stopped seeing the worth and value of all of his creation, and the part that we read today in Numbers is where he demonstrated his heart towards these daughters. They had value. They had a claim that God validated through Moses. God is willing to step across society's traditions to do what is right. And that didn't just happen in the Old Testament. Let's jump to the Gospels and see another time when God said that a soul was more important than the social norm. Turn with me to John chapter 4, verse 5. It says, "So he came to a town of Samaria called Sychar, near the field that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and so Jesus, wearied as he was from his journey, was sitting beside the well. It was about the 6th hour. A woman from Samaria came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, 'Give me a drink,' for his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. And the Samaritan said to him, 'How is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a woman of Samaria? For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans.'" Now, Jesus had traveled into a region that was not friendly to the Jews. There was a long-standing feud between the Israelites and the Samaritans, even though they shared some common history. He started in this interaction with a Samaritan woman at the well, and the part that connects to what we had read earlier in Numbers is that Jesus was speaking directly with this woman. She was even taken aback by it, the fact that he was talking to her. It was weird for her. It was not the way things were done in society, but Jesus was breaking all these cultural rules for a reason. And the disciples even got tripped up by it. In verse 27, they say, "Just then the disciples came back, and they marveled that he was talking with a woman. But no one said, 'What do you seek?' or 'Why are you talking to her?'" If you keep reading in John, the woman took the message that Jesus had just shared with her at the well. She goes back to the city, and a lot of people claim that she really became the first missionary in the New Testament. This was so far out of the cultural norm, but it is exactly how Jesus wanted it to be. Which brings us to our application for the night. Guys, we need to be careful that our traditions and our societal norms never make someone seem like less than the creation God made them to be. In Numbers and in John, women were looked down on society, and yet in both cases, God pushed aside the norm and gave worth to these ladies. And it's not just a women's right issue, though. Society is made flawed by people and by sinful decisions that become society's norms. In the passage we read today, as well as the rest of Scripture, we see God giving great value to the people that he created. That means everyone has value and everyone has worth. Even the people that hate God and say all kinds of evil things against him, God still wants those people to come out of darkness and into the light of Jesus. We need to be sure that we don't let the norms of our society confuse us to our true citizenship as children of God, guys. We need to love others and treat them with the same amount of compassion that God has shown towards us. Our enemy uses a fallen society to put labels and value on people that only divides us and hurts us. It doesn't take much to find examples of inequality in our world, but those examples are not God-made. They're man-made. I think understanding God's view of other people, it would be a great start in solving inequality in all areas of our life. Instead of trying to legislate fairness, let's love others as God has instructed us to. And I'm guessing a lot of those inequalities, man, they're going to start to fade away on their own. It all comes back to us loving others as ourselves. And this is the second part of the great commandment we find in Scripture. As we have looked at the weird stories in the book of Numbers, they've hit on some very modern problems that we're facing, inequality being the most recent. This last week wasn't a crazy miracle. It was just God pushing back on unfair, man-made laws to show the value that he has placed on every single soul in creation. I hope you guys have enjoyed the series. Man, it's been a blast to study for this thing and prep for it. I want you to keep reading the book of Numbers. There are so many weird stories that we just didn't have time to get into. So enjoy the book, enjoy what God's doing. Can't wait to see you guys soon.